Thank you all for being here this afternoon, and welcome to the Highway Hex. This is the first solo museum exhibition of artist Will Boone. My name is Patricia Restrepo, and I am the Assistant Curator and Exhibitions Manager here at the Contemporary Arts Museum Houston. And it has been my immense pleasure watching this exhibition come to fruition alongside Will over the past 2 years. It is our collective good fortune that we have Will here to talk about his work in the gallery amongst the pieces themselves, so that's quite a privilege. I want to start by drawing your attention to the fact that this exhibition exemplifies Will's expanded artistic practice, in that Will is able to unite artistic disciplines within the visual arts, such as painting, sculpture, and video, with disciplines not typically associated with visual arts, including model making, the collection of found objects, and industrial production. So Will, I thought we would start by zooming out and having you talk about how you decide which form is the ideal conduit for your concepts.
Well, I think that this is weird to hear myself. I think that as an artist, I feel like it's really important to be flexible. And I was thinking about it today, it's sort of like going to the grocery store or something when you just kind of get the ingredients that you like and then you figure out how to use them, once you have them. And so I do that with ideas and with materials. I'll find something and I'll spend time with it, and then I'll sort of figure out what it wants to be. And then sometimes when I'm working on it, it completely shifts. There are things that I made that ended up in this video that I made as paintings that I didn't think about using as props. And then there were things that I made as props for the movie that I ended up not using in the movie and considering them sculptures or artworks. So I think that it's important to stay open and kind of listen to what you're doing.
In addition to being so open and flexible, your practice is also characterized by investigation, research, and experimentation. Like Solowit, who always wanted to take the opportunity to produce new work instead of necessarily falling back on extant work that had been deemed successful, you took this invitation for an exhibition as an opportunity to produce a new series of work. How did you reach that decision, and how did that thinking evolve over the years of production?
Well, I think that it seemed like a great opportunity to show new work. The idea of kind of having like some sort of retrospective or going back and collecting work and showing it again wasn't that exciting for me at this point in my career. I was thinking about this space a whole lot and how I could make something that would fit this space, and it seemed like it would be most exciting to make new work. I think about like playing music, or it's like music or sports or something where you kind of have one shot. And I think that as an artist, you can decide to do something over and over again and sort of pick the best one and edit yourself. But I really like to approach exhibitions kind of with this attitude, like, I'm just going to do it, and it is what it is, and kind of have faith in what I'm doing.
You've alluded to your familiarity with this space. You're from Houston, and I know for a short period of time you worked for this museum. Something that I really appreciated about Will's approach to this exhibition was that he was able to unite both a sincere consideration of the gallery and creating site-specific work, while also considering the place that the museum is sited in, both in Houston and Texas at large. And so I'm wondering how you came to terms with the marriage of both the specificity of place and space in this exhibition.
Well, I think that, this idea of sort of simultaneously having my first show be in an institution happened to be the place that I was from. It seemed really kind of it was kind of all I was thinking about. So I decided to sort of lean into that and try and make the show be about that.
And how did you respond to the nature of this being a subterranean space that seems to be in line with the ethos of your practice?
Well, it kind of goes back to like music or something where it's like you got to play the room that you're in. You know what I mean? And there are things that I knew that we could control the lighting down here, so it seemed like a really good opportunity to do some pieces like this, and also to have a video playing. I was thinking about how like a TV lights up a darkened room, and I kind of wanted the museum to sort of have that feeling, like the lights changing and bouncing off the wall. And you know, there are things like I got into making models as a way of sort of experimenting with ideas for sculptures or for bigger, ambitious projects. And then kind of to learn how to make models, I'd watch videos on YouTube of like these old men who do model train sets. And there's this one guy who, he had this train set that he spent like 30 years working on, and it occupied his entire basement. And I think it's sort of, it's this really beautiful thing, and I knew that I wanted to take this idea of making models and sort of make a large model. And so my studio is right by the LA River, so I made this model of the LA River with this idea that it would kind of fill this space, you know?
So I think we can turn our attention to Sweet Perfume, which is Will's first long-form video, and really what I consider to be the fulcrum of the exhibition. Can you tease out the genesis of this film?
Well, so being in LA, you think about movies a lot, and it's exciting to me. Like, for example, one of my favorite movies is this movie called Repo Man. And after I started working in my studio in LA, I realized that it was filmed a couple blocks away from my studio. So then I started to feel like I had a relationship to the movie, or the movie was influencing my work somehow. And I also was thinking about, you know, I've always had sort of ideas for movies, and my friends have ideas for movies, but they're really just stories. And it became interesting to me that it's like, that's the format in which we think about storytelling, I think, now. Instead of being like I don't have anybody who says, I have this really good idea for a book. Everyone is like, I've got this great idea for a movie. And so it seemed to be like the vessel for a narrative. And like I was saying, I was thinking about my own sort of trip back to Texas for this show, and I decided to kind of like explore that with this video. So I created this narrative. I was inspired by a type of writing called fan fiction, and it's sort of like this idea where someone that really likes a movie or a book or something, like, say you really like Star Wars, you know, you could take like the characters from Star Wars and write your own story with them. And so I was thinking about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the movie, and I was thinking about Leatherface, the character, who's sort of like the main character in the movie. And at the end of the movie, he's chasing this woman on the highway, and she gets in this truck, and she gets away. And Leatherface just kind of like, he doesn't have anyone to chase with this chainsaw anymore. And so he kind of starts dancing, and the sun's coming up. And it was like, wow, maybe that's like what Leatherface really is, you know? And maybe that's what Leatherface wants to be doing. Like, what if Leatherface moved to California, you know? And like, what if Leatherface left his family? What would that be like? And so I thought that was funny. And so then I started thinking about, well, then, what if Leatherface was in California, then he had to go back to Texas? And then I write a lot, and so then it sort of became this thing that I got to write, you know? And so I wrote a screenplay, and the screenplay, at first I was thinking about music videos, and kind of like, I didn't want it to be a movie that you had to sit down and watch. I wanted it to be something you could watch like a few minutes of. but I wanted there to be a narrative, and I wanted to have a structure so that it could sort of stand independently. Like you could watch it if you really wanted to. And I was thinking about movies that I like. I was thinking a lot about a movie called Slacker by Richard Linklater that's about Austin. And it's sort of this character just kind of goes around and people are talking at him. And so I started thinking about that, thinking about monologues. So I wrote these monologues to go in different parts of the movie. Some of them are like based on stories that I tell. Some of them I made up. And some of them, and then some of it was like, then the movie sort of became, it was like, oh, this is a cool idea, but like I don't know how to make a movie. And I started thinking about this thing that a lot of, well, not a lot, but some artists, they reach a point in their career and they decide they're going to make a film, and it's sort of this like heroic effort, and the movies are really heavy and kind of overdone. And I was like, am I doing that? Am I, like, why do I want to make a movie? And instead of sort of being in LA and finding like someone to produce it or someone to shoot it or a screenwriter, I was just like, what if I just, chase my wife around with a camcorder for like a year, And so that was sort of what we did, And I used my studio as like a set, so I used all these things that I'd collected for sculptures, and I used my paintings that were in the studio, in the movie. I used my car. We really tried not to buy anything.
So in addition to being heavily involved with the production of the screenplay, you were also involved with the musical components in the score. Can you speak to what that process was like?
Yeah, I have a really good friend named Lucas who's also from Houston. He's a professional musician in LA, and we grew up playing in sort of punk bands together. And so, Stephanie, my wife, really helped me make the movie. And Lucas, we played music together in our early 20s and stuff, so we have this really close relationship. And so I decided, I would come up with these sort of loose ideas for songs, and I would write them, and then me and Lucas would sit down. And it'd kind of be like, we'd be shooting the movie in the middle of the morning, and then we'd eat lunch, and then Lucas would come to the studio, and we'd record a song, and then I'd start painting. And so it was all kind of mixed together. That's Lucas right there. And so it was a collaborative thing, and it's one of the first times that I've really pulled someone else into my work and worked with them. So we were writing the music, and then he ended up being in the movie, and he's really great, and it was a lot of fun to work on.
And in addition to collaborating with individuals you knew, like your wife and Lucas, you also ended up reaching out to artists you respect to be included, like Terry Allen. How did you navigate that dynamic, and what was that like for you?
It was an interesting experience. I'm a huge fan of the artist Terry Allen, and he does music and he does art, and he does his music and his albums involve lots of talking and reading. And so there's a part in the movie where, Leatherface has to go back to Texas. And so I imagined the character getting this letter from like a neighbor saying that, the family house has been taken by the bank. You've got to come and get all the stuff out of it, all your family stuff. And then this is what's happened to your family since you've been gone. And as I was writing it, I just could hear Terry Allen reading it. And everything kind of growing up in Houston and playing music and sort of being involved in the punk scene, there's you would reach out to people if you wanted them to help you do something. So I decided to just start writing Terry and, asking him to narrate part of the movie. And so eventually I got a hold of him. I happened to be in Houston, and he was signing. I was in Houston for one of my best friend's weddings, and Terry happened to be signing albums at Cactus Records. So I went over there and introduced myself. he kind of sniffed me out, and then I didn't know if he wanted to do it. And then he was in LA over the summer, and I went and met him there again. So then finally he committed to doing it, but I didn't actually get the recording from him until like 3 weeks ago. So it was like kind of this crazy thing, you know. And it was like, is it gonna happen? Is it gonna happen? And it happened. It was very generous of him, and I think it was really kind of made the movie.
I really appreciated the stories you told about some of the performative aspects of filming this and your relationship with the camera that you use. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, so it's kind of like, I like to stick with the things I'm familiar with. I had this camcorder that I had used kind of from high school on. The kind of camcorder that you use to film your friends doing skateboarding tricks, or like your friend's band's playing in a garage or whatever. And it was made for news, like low budget news crews. So you can kind of move around with it. But they're also kind of like burners, you know, they're cheap, and like, I think we went through 3 or 4 of them while we were working on the movie. They would die in the middle of the desert and stuff like that. And you can't see through it either, really. So I was trying to figure out how to shoot it, and I started to think about William Eggleston. I read this thing. I think he said this, but I might be making this up. But he was talking about using his camera like a shotgun, you know, like an extension of his body, and kind of using a feeling, you know, and trusting a feeling to take his pictures rather than aiming the camera and framing everything. And so it's also part of the loose nature of making the film. It was just kind of like, okay, let's do it. You know, we weren't reshooting things. There were a couple things that just didn't work, you know, that we fixed. But for the most part, it was like, you know, live. It's like one take, let's just see what we can do, you know.
And something that I really appreciated in my conversations with Will as this piece was coming to fruition was that he viewed the video almost as a sculpture that could create the conditions of light and space and really set the atmospheric tone for the installation as a whole. And so to honor that vision, initially we had discussed not having any seating in the gallery, but ultimately we decided to include the assisted ready-made that some of you are sitting on now. So can you speak to that piece, Will, and how it ties in with your fascination with car culture?
Yeah, you know, a lot of times when you have a van, the back seat kind of gets taken out of the van because you move stuff around, and then maybe you put it in your house, maybe you don't have a couch, so then maybe you end up sitting on this van seat. And it's weird to sit in a car seat, not in a car. You know, you kind of feel like you should be moving, but you're not. And I had this Chevy Blazer that I really liked, and I really, really liked the back seat. And I sold the car, but I kept the back seat, you know, and I had it in my studio. So then eventually we welded kind of like a base for it, you know, and then we put a light underneath it. And I was thinking about, there's this writer I like a lot named Harry Crews, and he has this book called Car, and it's about this family that has a junkyard with all these cars. They have every different kind of car. And people come to the junkyard and they pay money to go and sit in different cars. You know, like say, there's a guy who died in the war, and his wife, in the junkyard there's a pickup truck that's identical to the truck that he drove. So his wife goes there and sits in the car and, you know, thinks about him and watches the sunset. Or, you know, there's a car that this guy lost his virginity in, and he goes back to that car, you know, and sits in it or something. And so I was thinking about how you could have sort of this relationship to an object like that, and how it could have a deep personal meaning for someone.
And there are several sculptures that expand out and have a really fascinating and dynamic relation to the video, including the Los Angeles River, which is, or the river, which is this 20-foot model of the Los Angeles River that Will built. It is used in the opening scene of Sweet Perfume, and as a location is also a site that Face visits in the film in order to go fishing. You've already spoken to how this piece fits in with the subterranean nature of this gallery, but is there anything else you want to talk about in relation to this piece?
Yeah, so the LA River is like this really weird thing. You know, it's sort of this big concrete ditch. Parts of it, water goes through. People go fishing in parts of it. I don't know what kind of fish they catch, but... And I was thinking about Los Angeles, and Houston's kind of the same way, where it's sort of like a concrete veneer. Houston kind of feels like, you know, it's this concrete veneer over the swamp, and there's sort of this wetness and this moisture that's always trying to come up through the concrete. And LA is kind of similar, but it's sort of the opposite. It's the desert, you know, and so the desert kind of feels like it's charged with energy, you know, and I don't know if it's because the sun is cooking it all day. And Los Angeles just kind of feels like, you know, it's concrete right over that energy, you know, and everyone kind of lives in fear of the big earthquake and the earth opening up. And so I started making drawings of the LA River, and as I was making the drawings, I started to imagine sort of this space. And I'm pretty sure, you know, that nothing's there, but I was drawing it and thinking about it, and then I went to Mexico, and I went to Oaxaca, and we went to some pyramids, and I started researching the pyramids and watching TV shows like Ancient Aliens, where they talk about there's these hidden tunnels and chambers within these structures, and that's where this power would emanate out of. And I started to think about this red light, the red neon light that you see driving around Los Angeles, and that sort of also representing this energy. And the river kind of, you know, being this place of power, you know, a place where people go to cleanse themselves, and like in songs and stuff like that, I talk about going down to the river. And so I wanted to make this sculpture because I wanted the movie to start with this shot of the LA River with sort of like this red sun rising over it. And I realized that didn't exist. I had to figure out how to make that. So we built this in my studio, we videotaped it, and simultaneously considering it going right here in the show all along, like having this other life as an artwork. But also like a tool to create this image that I use in the video. Is that kind of what?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
At this point, I think we can pivot to the second gallery if everyone wants to join us. So this is a site-specific installation that Will created for the gallery entitled The Melting Cowboy. And even the title itself refers to the thematics of flow and transition and movement that unite so much of this work in the Highway Hex. So Will, can you speak to how you decided to merge two sets from Sweet Perfume into this one installation at CAM?
Sure. So as I was working on the movie, you know, I knew that I couldn't shoot I knew I couldn't shoot the whole movie just finding places, and I was going to need to build a few scenes, which I was really excited about doing. And so in my studio, there was this sort of room where I keep all my tools and my paint and stuff, and we turned that into this bar. I painted it black, and we put lights all over the inside, and I decorated the walls. And then it stayed like that. It stayed like that for like 9 months or a year or something. So that became the place where we would record the music. And then outside of that room, on the wall, I sort of built this pawn shop, and I knew that I wanted to have a scene in the movie where Leatherface goes to a pawn shop and sells the chainsaw so that she can get money to go back to Texas. And I was thinking about, like, what if the pawn shop guy is way scarier than Leatherface? And I started thinking about how could I do that, you know, and like, I didn't want to cast actors, and so I ended up playing kind of all the other people, and I've never acted before. So I was thinking about sort of developing this character, but maybe I could just develop the character by creating an environment around him that would sort of describe him. And I started to think about like places I really like to go, like stores and pawn shops and junk shops, and bars are like this sometimes where you go and like it's a commercial, you know, it's like this place is supposed to be like making money, but you can't figure out how to buy anything, and nothing really looks like it's for sale. And I really like that. There's this flea market off of 59. I went there last weekend to try and make sure I didn't find anything else I wanted to use for this. And it's like that. And so when I thought about the idea of installing one of the sets in the museum as part of the show, it seemed interesting to sort of make a hybrid of the two, which then kind of made me think, well, a pawn shop and a bar in one, I really like that idea, and that kind of seems like the kind of thing that would be in Houston already. And there's a humor to it, there's a desperation, and there's like a sort of temporary fix kind of hope to it. So that's kind of what I was thinking with this. So I used lots of stuff that I was in the movie. I used a lot of stuff that I collected. When you collect stuff, people also dump a lot of stuff on you that they think that you want to collect. And that's been interesting. So some of that is this stuff. And then, it goes back to being flexible and allowing things to come in and allowing things to go. For example, I got to Houston and my friend Justin was like, hey dude, on Craigslist, they're selling the toilet from the holding cell from the courthouse downtown, and I hadn't planned on using that in this installation, but it made its way in.
As did the soy sauce container.
Right, yeah, and so then in the movie, I have this cactus at my house that we used in the movie, and I have it in this soy sauce bucket. And I really like the cactus in the soy sauce bucket. I got really excited about putting it in the show. And the week or two before we were leaving, I went to pick up the bucket. And it had been outdoors, and it's just my fingers went right through it. And it was like this potato chip. And I was like, the soy sauce bucket, the soy sauce bucket. And I was really sad. And then the first day we were installing, we were driving down Richmond to go eat lunch. And right by Tapatia Taqueria, I was driving and Stephanie goes, there's a soy sauce bucket. Stop the car. And she jumped out and ran and got the soy sauce bucket and we threw it in the back seat. So yeah, and it's fun to bring that kind of thing into the museum. I think that part of occupying a space like this is sneaking some stuff in the back,
So you've spoken to the history of some of the newer acquisitions in this installation, but could you also talk through some of the histories of the found objects you've included, as well as some of the surreal sculptures you've created and folded in?
Yeah, it sort of became interesting to think about things that were kind of totally unrelated and kind of nonsense, and then to sort of merge those with things that are kind of have a deeper meaning to me or some sort of personal history involved. So I also had this idea of employing one of the paintings into the installation, and this one has pictures of my family and my friends in it. And then some of this stuff in here, it's sort of true crime memorabilia, some of it that I collected and some of it people gave me. I have this ring that I won in a pool game off of this guy that was in the Pagans Motorcycle Club, and I beat him at pool, and then he was like, don't leave here. And then he went outside and got on his motorcycle, and I was like, oh no, what's about to happen? And then he came back 5 minutes or 10 minutes later, and he had this ring. He's like, this is your totem. And he gave me this wolf ring. Years ago, I was visiting a friend in Austin, and outside of their apartment, the neighbor was sitting there, and he was telling me how he was he just got an architecture school or something, and he was working on this project, and the house that they were remodeling had been Charles Whitman's house, the guy who climbed the clock tower at the University of Houston. And so I was like, what's the address, And so he gave me the address, and then I went over there. And I went in the window, and the only thing that was kind of left was this linoleum floor. and I had a pocket knife, and so I cut a big piece of the linoleum floor and rolled it up, and then I cut it into squares, and so maybe this was like 15 years ago or something, and ever since then, I've given them out to different people who I thought would like them. I gave a piece of it to John Waters. And so it's like, yeah, I dump stuff on people too, I guess.
And with this true crime referential component and then several of the other additions, you acknowledge the fact that in much of the public's minds, they have coupled Texas with violence. And although you address that through your work, you also add nuance and complexity. For instance, yesterday you were talking about likening the pit bull to face and that it's misunderstood. And then maybe you could also speak to the mask and how you've humanized Leatherface's mask.
Right. There's this author named Lawrence Wright who wrote a book called God Save Texas that I really enjoyed, and it's a series of essays. And in one of the essays, he's talking about kind of this point, maybe it's around the JFK assassination, where the depiction of Texas kind of shifts from this expansive, sort of beautiful place of promise, like something in a Western, to kind of like this spooky place where there's drifters and chainsaw killers. And being outside of Texas and being from Texas, observing how people react to my Texan hood or ness. And you know, sometimes people think I'm going to be a certain way because of where I'm from. There's another artist that I like a lot named Katie Noland, and she spoke a lot about how Texas, same thing around the JFK assassination, became sort of shorthand for violence or for murder. But I think there's a real duality to it. There's also like a real humor, you know? And so, yeah, you're asking about the pit bull paintings. The pit bull paintings, the first one my wife and I found was this one, and maybe like 8 years ago. And then I found the same painting, but someone had taken it off the stretcher and they stretched it over a bar stool, which is incredibly interesting to me. I don't know why. Maybe they want it to be round, and that was the only round thing that they have. And then I found the other two. So, and then I have a pit bull, and I think a lot about her, and I see how people react to her, you know. And then I started to think about the character Leatherface and kind of being like, well, maybe he's like a pit bull, you know. Maybe someone like made him into what he was, and if he got rescued, you know, he'd be a happy person.
Relatedly, do you want to talk about the mask that you decided to include in the installation as well?
Yeah, and so I was sort of like imagining, like, you know, Leatherface living in the hills, in these hills in East LA where I live, you know, and like kind of being a gardener. And so when it came time to sort of figure out what the mask would be, you know, we have these piles of gardening gloves that kind of float around and stuff. And I was looking at the material, you know, it's like goat skin or something, and the way it would weather, and one would turn this color, and one would turn that color. And so I was thinking about, well, what if Leatherface's mask was made out of gardening gloves instead of like, I guess it's supposed to be human skin or something like that. And so the mask, this is the mask that we used in the movie. I took my belt and cut it up, and then I sewed together this thing out of pieces of gardening gloves.
And as Will was installing the Melting Cowboy, he made a really beautiful observation in that he considered the installation of the lights to be like expanded drawing, which I really appreciated. And if we follow the arc of these lights, you will see Will's Jukebox, which of course everyone knows is the archetypal musical accompaniment to any classic Texas bar. But this is not an ordinary jukebox. So how did you make this bootleg creation?
I can't remember, you know, it's hard to remember what comes first. I knew that I wanted it to be in the movie, but I think I made this scene up around this. I had this stereo that I pulled out of a car, so I started to think about how I could listen to it outside of the car. And at the same time, I had this collection of cassette tapes. I like to listen to cassette tapes in my studio because you just kind of like put it in and you don't mess with it. And sometimes I'll zone out and it'll just keep turning over and over again. And so the collection of tapes, I had like all different kinds of tapes in here. And I had maybe like this many George Jones tapes. And then every time I would come across one, I would add it. And then I'd have to take something out. You know, it's like, sorry, Joy Division, you gotta go, George Jones. And then it sort of was like, it was slowly replacing everything. And then for a while I had, you know, like a lot of my friends who grew up in Texas, they didn't really like country music until they were older and they left. You know, and so I was reaching to a point where I was listening to lots and lots of country music. And I had this guy who was helping me in my studio, and he was from Staten Island, and he just like could not, I could tell it was driving him insane. And I liked it, so it just made me want to listen to it more. And so then it was sort of like, well, I want to build this structure that can hold these tapes, and it could also have a stereo. It'll be like a jukebox, you know? And so he built this thing. I was also thinking about guitar amps. It's sort of the shape of like a full stack, like two Marshall guitar amps, and I put these handles on it, and it rolls around kind of like an amplifier. But then it was funny because I was, you know, there's like this Ken Burns country music documentary thing that came out like a month ago or something, and I was watching it. And it got to this part about Buck Owens and about how he was so concerned about the way that his music would sound out of a car. Like he knew that's where everyone's going to be listening to his music. That in the recording studio, he installed car speakers. So like instead of listening to really nice studio monitors where you can hear like bass and where the stereo is, it was like, I don't care about any of that. I just want to hear how it sounds out of like the little car speakers. So I thought it was really interesting.
And this piece also links back to thematics around mobility and transportation. As you mentioned, it's on casters, but it's also powered by a lawnmower battery so that it can be cordless. Why was that decision important for you?
I guess it kind of has some sort of autonomy, you know? I guess it feels like a vehicle that way, like it can move around and work wherever, you know? I didn't want it to feel anchored in one place. Yeah, sure.
And then finally, I think we can discuss the 5 paintings that you created for this exhibition. For those of you that know Will's work, I think you might agree that although these have a familiar energy, they definitely have taken a different approach and that they're so horizontally focused and the narratives within them seem to unfold. How did you reach the decision to create this body of work?
Well, previously a lot of my paintings were like vertical and kind of condensed. I made a bunch of paintings that were like of words, but all the letters on top of one another and lines and everything kind of folding inward and being compressed. And I didn't really think about it at the time, but I started that work while I was living in New York. And like, it's the New York way to sort of figure out how to condense everything and how you can have as much stuff occupy as little space. And then I moved to LA. And I was working on these paintings. I was thinking about this space and the low ceilings and sort of long walls. And just like the video or whatever, I was thinking, how do I make work that will like work within this space? And so I started thinking about painting kind of like these more horizontal paintings. And at the same time, I was spending all this time in the desert filming. And where I live in Los Angeles, you sort of have this view. And so I think just differently. And that affected the paintings. I feel like these are more like about stretching out, you know, and kind of like time and elasticity. So like the lines are longer. These are materials I've been using for a while. I think we're talking about kind of like having flexibility, you know, like, so this stuff, the shiny stuff is this resin they use to cast objects, or you use it to put on the top of a bar. Like when you go in a bar and they have like, I don't know, coins and like trinkets encased in the bar, they use this material. And I was using it for a sculpture, and it's two parts, and you mix it together and you start stirring it. And as I was stirring it, it was like, this is exactly the same consistency as my paint that I use. Like this feels just like mixing paint, but it's clear, you know? And so what if I started like, I could cast with it, but what if I tried to use it as paint, you know? And so then I started putting on the paintings. And it also functions as glue. Whatever you put into it, you're not going to be able to get it out. And I was thinking about like Robert Rauschenberg's paintings and assemblage, and that sort of being this additive thing, like you build out from the canvas, it expands outward, and the resin seems to sort of suck everything in. And at the same time working with the video, where the video kind of feels like this bottomless pit, like I could put more stuff into the video, you can put more colors, you can put more objects, you can put more scenes, you can put more music, and you could really test how much it can hold. I felt like the paintings were kind of similar, where it's like I could put things into them and see how much they would allow. So I had collected objects, you know, that were maybe going to be in the movie, and some of them I used in the paintings.
And considering your material choices, in this case, you have a deconstructed state trooper jacket. In this painting, Lazy X. In the other gallery, Will has included a moving blanket. The thematics of movement and transportation are palpable yet again. So I'm wondering why you continuously choose to work with such charged materials.
I mean, I try not to choose. I just try to follow the thing that I find the most interesting. And so it just seemed like a good idea to cut this thing in half and stretch it out, and then put it into a painting.
And the thematic of mobility is even furthered by your decision to name this series Arterials. Can you speak to why you chose that term?
I was thinking about this color, this red, and it's like sort of like a blood red, but not like a real color of blood, kind of like the color of blood that would be in a movie like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And I was thinking about the decision that whoever made the filmmaker, whoever was in charge of fake blood. Why did they use blood that doesn't look real? Why would they use something that's so bright? And it seemed like it was because the intensity of the color was more important than it looking realistic. And so I was thinking about, I think like arterial blood is the most oxygenated blood, and it's supposed to be the brightest. And I looked up the word arterial to make sure it was a real word, because I was using it a lot. And then one of the definitions was relating to a road or a through road. And so I was like, oh, that makes sense. The arteries in your body are sort of like these roadways. And the duality of that meaning, kind of like it being about this color, but then also being about relationship to a road, sort of influenced my decision to pick the materials that I did to use in the paintings.
Well, I think we've reached our time for our walkthrough. Thank you all for your interest in this exhibition and in the practice and work of Will Boone. And of course, an enormous thank you to Will. for his generosity as a spirit in sharing this work with the city of Houston at large, and then also in speaking with us today. So thank you all for being here again, and I hope you all enjoyed.
Thank you.